The architects of debt. The smell in Lower Manhattan on the morning of September 28, 1915, was the smell of fresh ink and old money. Telegrams were stacking up in marble lobbies along Wall Street. 2,200 banks across America had just been bound together into a single financial instrument, and somewhere in a private office at 23 Wall Street, a man named Jack Morgan was signing his name to a piece of paper worth $500 million. It was the largest single loan in the history of the world up to that moment, and not one drop of American blood had yet been spilled on a European battlefield. This is the story they don't quite teach you in school. The story of how the United States became the most powerful nation on earth, and how the foundation of that power was poured quietly in shadowed boardrooms, while the rest of the world was bleeding itself dry. Let me ask you to picture something. The year is 1914. The world is on fire. In Belgium and northern France, young men are dying in mud that smells of sulphur and copper. In London, the lights are going out across the empire, and in New York, a city that 30 years earlier had been a rough provincial port, the bankers are quietly doing their math. Here is the math. Before the war began, the United States was a debtor nation. The country owed the world about $3.2 billion. It was a young economy, sprawling, energetic, but financially still in the shadow of London. The Bank of England ran the world's money. New York was a junior partner. Most Americans, if you had asked them, would have said their country was an outsider, an island, a place that minded its own business while Europe carried the weight of empire. Here is what I find striking. That self-image, the innocent America, the reluctant America, was already, by 1914, a comforting illusion. Because the moment the guns began firing in Europe, a small group of men in Lower Manhattan understood something most of their countrymen did not. War is, before anything else, a transaction. And every transaction needs a banker. The banker was John Pierpont Morgan, Jr. His friends called him Jack. He was the son of the legendary J.P. Morgan, the man who had bailed out the United States Treasury back in 1895. In January of 1915, the British government walked into his office and signed a piece of paper that would change the world. It was called the Commercial Agency Agreement. It was, on its face, a simple document. The British government would pay J.P. Morgan and Company a 1% commission on every dollar of war material the firm purchased on Britain's behalf inside the United States. Cotton, steel, chemicals, food, boots, rifles, shells, anything Britain needed to keep its armies alive in the trenches of Flanders, Morgan would buy. A 1% commission sounds modest until you understand the scale. Between January of 1915 and April of 1917, during the years America claimed to be neutral, the House of Morgan procured more than $3 billion in war material for the Allies. Roughly 60% of that was arms and munitions. The 1% commission alone came to $30 million. In an era when a comfortable middle-class family lived on $2,000 a year, $30 million was a king's ransom. But the commission was just the beginning, because Morgan was not only the purchasing agent, he was also the lender. In the autumn of 1915, with British and French gold reserves running dry, Lord Reading sailed across the Atlantic at the head of a delegation called the Anglo-French Financial Commission. They came to ask Wall Street for credit, and Jack Morgan delivered. He organized a syndicate of about 2,200 American banks, almost every significant institution in the country, and floated that $500 million bond issue, paying 5% interest over 5 years. 2,200 banks. Almost every banker in America was now financially invested in an Allied victory. Not as a matter of patriotism, as a matter of arithmetic. If Britain and France lost, those bonds would be worthless. The bankers had quietly turned the American financial system into a stakeholder in someone else's war. By April of 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson finally asked Congress to declare war on Germany, American banks had lent the Allies over $2.7 billion. The official story is that America entered the war to defend democracy, to punish German submarine warfare, to answer the Zimmermann telegram. All of that is true. But there was another truth, less comfortable, sitting in those ledger books. If the Allies lost, America's banking system might collapse with them. Now, the way I read this, none of this means American soldiers died for Wall Street. The young men who shipped out to France believed in what they were fighting for, and many gave everything. But whether the United States ever had a real choice about entering that war, once Morgan had bound the financial system to the Allied cause, that is a question historians have argued for 100 years. The Senate's Nye Committee in the 1930s concluded that bankers and munitions makers had quietly steered the country toward a profitable war. Whether you accept that conclusion or reject it, by 1917 the bankers had a lot of skin in the game. And what skin it was! By the time the guns fell silent in November of 1918, the position of the United States had been transformed beyond recognition. In 1914, America had been a net debtor of $3.2 billion. By 1919, America was a net creditor of $6.4 billion. The world had financed its war with American money, and now it owed America back. 20 nations carried debts to the United States Treasury totaling by 1922 over $11.5 billion. In today's money, that figure would translate to something close to $200 billion of leverage held over the governments of Europe. The financial centre of the world had moved. London no longer dictated. New York did. The Bank of England, for 2 centuries the most powerful financial institution on earth, had been quietly displaced, and in its place stood the Federal Reserve, an institution barely 4 years old when the war began. Notice what is missing from the official story. The textbooks tell you about the Versailles Treaty and the 14 points. They tell you about Wilson's idealism and the failure of the League of Nations. What they tend to skip over is the cold financial architecture that the war left behind. The reparations Germany was forced to pay to Britain and France were largely funneled, through complicated currency arrangements, back to the United States to service those Allied war debts. The whole of Europe spent the 1920s paying America, and then, in 1931, when the global banking crisis hit, President Hoover granted a 1-year moratorium on those payments. The Europeans never resumed regular payment. By 1934, every European nation except Finland had defaulted. And here is what I think the deepest lesson of this period really is. The men who built the foundation of American power in the early 20th century did not do it with armies or with conquest. They did it with paperwork, with ledgers, with the quiet, patient, almost invisible work of holding other people's debts. He who holds the debt holds the leash. And by 1919, America held more leashes than any nation in history. The architects of this transformation were not for the most part politicians. They were bankers. They were treasury officials. They were the men who understood, before anyone else, that the 20th century would not be won by whoever had the largest army. It would be won by whoever held the largest stack of other people's promises to pay. The First World War ended in 1918. The roaring 20s came and went. The gold flowed steadily into American vaults. By the end of the 1930s, the United States had nearly tripled its gold reserves, much of it arriving as terrified European capital fleeing the rise of Hitler. The country that had once been a junior partner in the global financial system was now, very quietly, becoming the system itself. But quiet power has a strange relationship with history. It tends to wait for the next crisis. And as the dust of one world war settled, men in basements and offices in Washington and London were already beginning to ask the question that would shape the rest of the century. If America was now the world's banker, what would happen the next time the world burned? What would happen if this time America was the one who got to write the rules? In a quiet hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire in the summer of 1944, those rules would be written. And the world the rest of us still live in would be born. There is a building in the White Mountains of New Hampshire called the Mount Washington Hotel. It is a vast, white wooden palace built in 1902 for the very rich. By 1930, the family who owned it had gone bankrupt, and the hotel had closed. For 14 years, its windows were boarded. Snow piled against its locked doors. Then, in the spring of 1944, men in dark suits arrived from Washington. They paid the owners $300,000 to reopen. They cleared the staff and brought in their own. And on July 1st, 1944, while the war in Europe was still raging, while American boys were still dying on the beaches of Normandy, 730 men from 44 nations arrived at this hotel in the middle of the woods to redesign the world. They came in secret. The hotel was sealed. Boy Scouts ran the microphones because the organizers did not trust outside technicians. And in the ballroom where industrialists had once waltzed, the most consequential financial meeting in human history was about to begin. This is the part of the story your textbooks rarely linger on. Because the soldiers were still bleeding, because Hitler was still alive, because the Pacific was still on fire. And while all of that was true, while all of that filled the newspapers, the real war, the one that would decide who ran the next 100 years, was being fought, quietly, in a hotel in the woods. Let me ask you to picture this. Outside the windows, you can see the slopes of Mount Washington. Inside, the air smells of cigarette smoke and old wood polish. The men working through the night are not generals. They are economists. They are bankers. They are central bank presidents and treasury officials. The chief American negotiator is a man named Harry Dexter White, an assistant to the United States Treasury Secretary. The chief British negotiator is the most famous economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes. These two men have spent 2 years arguing in private memos. Keynes wants a new global currency, something called the bancor, controlled by an international institution that no single nation can dominate. White wants the world to revolve around the dollar. White wants the dollar to be the sun and every other currency to be a planet pulled into its orbit. Keynes is the more famous man. He is also dying. He has 18 months to live. And he is, in this room, the negotiator from a bankrupt empire. Britain has spent itself broke fighting 2 world wars. Its gold has flowed across the Atlantic to pay for American weapons. The pound sterling, which had been the world's currency for over a century, is finished, and Keynes knows it. The question is not whether the British plan or the American plan will win. The question is how gracefully Britain will surrender. Here is what I find remarkable. Most accounts of Bretton Woods present it as a triumph of cooperation. 44 nations working together, building a new economic order. And there is truth in that. But underneath the cooperation was an asymmetry of breathtaking scale. Because by the summer of 1944, the United States held roughly 2/3 of all the gold reserves on Earth. 2/3. Of all the gold ever pulled from the ground in the history of human civilization, 2 out of every 3 ounces sat in American vaults, in places like Fort Knox, where it was guarded by soldiers behind walls of granite and steel. Stop and let that figure settle. 2/3 of the world's gold. The man who walks into a negotiation holding 2/3 of the chips does not need to argue very hard. He simply waits. And what the American delegation was waiting for, what they carefully and patiently arranged across those 3 weeks in July, was the moment when 43 other nations would agree to the architecture that Harry Dexter White had drafted. The architecture, when you strip away the technical language, was simple. Every other currency in the world would be pegged to the United States dollar. The dollar, in turn, would be pegged to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. International payments would be settled in dollars, international trade would flow in dollars, the dollar would be, as the bankers like to say, as good as gold. But there is a subtle move buried inside that arrangement. If every nation pegged its currency to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold, then in practice the United States was the only country in the world that still operated on a gold standard. Everyone else operated on a dollar standard. The world was now built on a single national currency, and the nation that issued that currency could, if it ever chose to, simply print more of it. That last possibility was supposed to be unthinkable in 1944. The dollar was disciplined by gold. The vaults were full. The American Treasury solemnly promised that any foreign government holding dollars could exchange them for gold at any time. The promise held the system together. For about 25 years, the promise held. The conference produced 2 new institutions, signed into existence on July 22, 1944. The first was the International Monetary Fund, which would oversee the new system of fixed exchange rates and lend to nations in trouble. The second was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which the world now knows as the World Bank. Both opened their offices in Washington, D.C., not in London, not in Geneva, in the capital of the United States. The Soviet delegation attended the entire conference. They signed the final act, and then, after returning to Moscow, they refused to ratify it. Joseph Stalin reportedly called the IMF and the World Bank in the famous phrase, "branches of Wall Street." Whether or not he used those exact words, the suspicion was correct. The system that emerged from Bretton Woods was an American system, run by Americans, headquartered on American soil, denominated in American money. The Soviets understood what was being built, and they refuse to live inside it. Here is what I think gets buried in the textbook version. Bretton Woods is usually told as a story of enlightenment, of nations learning after the disaster of the 1930s to cooperate. And that is true. But it is also a story of the single greatest transfer of financial power in human history, executed not with armies, but with paper. The British Empire walked into that hotel and walked out an American satellite. By 1945, when the war finally ended, the United States was producing more than half of all manufactured goods on Earth. American exports made up over a third of world trade. American factories, which had spent 4 years building tanks and ships and aircraft, now turned to building cars and refrigerators for a planet that had nothing left. Europe was rubble. Japan was ash. The Soviet Union had lost 26 million people. And America, untouched on its home soil, sat at the center of a system it had quietly designed. 3 years later, in April of 1948, President Harry Truman signed something called the Marshall Plan. The official name was the European Recovery Program. Over 4 years, the United States would transfer $13.3 billion in aid to 17 European countries, roughly $137 billion in today's money. The largest recipients were Britain, France, Italy, and West Germany. The Marshall Plan is remembered correctly as one of the most generous acts of foreign policy in modern history. But notice the architecture. The aid was delivered in dollars. Most of it was spent buying American goods. American factories had a guaranteed customer. European nations rebuilt their economies on American credit, in American currency, inside an institutional framework America had designed. Generosity and self-interest, in this case, were not opposites. They were the same act, viewed from 2 different angles. Notice what is missing from the official story. The textbooks present the Marshall Plan as charity, the IMF as cooperation, the dollar standard as practicality. And there is some truth in all 3 framings. But what they tend to leave out is the simple fact that by 1950, the United States held nearly 2/3 of the world's gold, controlled the institution that decided who got loans and on what terms, issued the currency that everyone else was forced to use, and stood as the sole industrial power left standing on the planet. That is not cooperation. That is empire. A new kind of empire, with no flag planted in foreign soil, no colonies on the map, no governor-generals in tropical capitals. An empire of arrangements, an empire of agreements, an empire whose fortresses were not made of stone, but of paper, signed in a hotel in the New Hampshire mountains, while better men were dying in better-known places. The bombs stopped falling in 1945, but the machinery of power did not sleep. It only changed shape. And the men who had designed that machinery understood something profound. The next century would not be one with armies. It would be one with rules. And the rules had just been written. The Invisible Empire. How do you build an empire that no one can see? Not with armies, not with flags planted on foreign soil, not with governors in white uniforms riding through colonial capitals. How do you build an empire so quiet that the people living inside it believe they are free? You build it the way a master locksmith builds a lock. You design it once, carefully, in a room far from anyone's view. You hide the mechanism behind a wall of paper, and you let the world try the door again and again, never realizing that every door is your door. This is the story of how the most powerful empire in human history learned to disappear. Not because it shrank, because it grew so large, so quiet, and so abstract that people stopped noticing it was there. Picture a small office in the basement of the United States Embassy in Tehran on the morning of August 19th, 1953. The man inside is named Kermit Roosevelt. He is the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, and he is, at this moment, running a coup. Outside, in the streets of the Iranian capital, paid mobs are screaming. Tanks are moving toward the Prime Minister's residence. The Prime Minister, a frail 71-year-old man named Mohammad Mossadegh, is about to be removed from power by his own military, with the discreet financial encouragement of the Central Intelligence Agency. Mossadegh's crime was that he had been democratically elected. And then, in May of 1951, he had nationalized Iran's oil. The British, who had been pumping that oil out of the ground for almost half a century, through a company called Anglo-Iranian Oil. The company that would soon rename itself British Petroleum, had asked the Americans for help. Under President Eisenhower, the Americans had agreed. The operation cost the Central Intelligence Agency a budget of $1 million. The code name was Operation TP Ajax. Between 200 and 300 Iranians died in the street violence. Mossadegh was sentenced to 3 years in prison and then placed under house arrest until the day he died. The young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was placed back on his throne. And in 1954, a consortium was formed in which British Petroleum kept 40% of Iranian oil, while American oil companies, Exxon, Mobil, and others, quietly took the rest. In August of 2013, 60 years after the coup, the Central Intelligence Agency officially admitted what every historian had long known. The agency had organized the operation. It had been the agency's first regime change operation, and it became, in their own internal documents, the template for everything that came after. Here is what I find chilling. The textbook version of the Cold War tells you about superpowers, about ideology, about the nuclear standoff. It tells you about Berlin and Cuba and Vietnam. What it tends to skip, almost entirely, is the parallel war the United States was fighting against democracies. Not against communism, against democracies that had made the wrong economic choices. 11 months after Tehran, on June 18, 1954, a small force of Central Intelligence Agency-backed rebels crossed into Guatemala. They were led by a colonel named Carlos Castillo Armas. The operation was called PB Success, and its target was another democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz had committed the same kind of crime as Mossadegh. In 1952, he had signed Decree 900, redistributing uncultivated farmland, most of it owned by an American corporation called the United Fruit Company. United Fruit owned 42% of all the arable land in Guatemala. Most of it sat unused. The country was so dominated by this single corporation that it earned a name. The name was Banana Republic. Notice the architecture. The Secretary of State who authorized the Guatemala coup was John Foster Dulles. The Director of Central Intelligence who ran it was his brother, Alan Dulles. Both men had spent their careers as partners in the law firm that represented the United Fruit Company. The total budget of the operation was between $5 and $7 million. Arbenz resigned on June 27, 1954. His country fell into 36 years of civil war that would kill 200,000 people. The way I read this, the pattern that emerged in those 2 summers, Tehran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, was not really about communism. It was about a quieter rule. You may govern your country however you wish, but you may not nationalize American assets. You may not redistribute land owned by American corporations. You may not refuse to play by the rules written in the New Hampshire mountains. If you do, the empire that pretends not to exist will remember very precisely that it does. For 2 decades, the system worked. The dollar held its value. The world settled into the architecture. American gold sat safely in the vaults at Fort Knox, and the promise that any foreign government could exchange its dollars for that gold at $35 per ounce held the entire edifice together. Then the cracks began to show. The Vietnam War turned out to be more expensive than anyone in Washington had calculated. President Lyndon Johnson refused to choose between guns and butter. He fought the war and expanded the welfare state at the same time, financed by printing more dollars. By 1967, the United States had $36 billion in foreign liabilities, but only $12 billion in gold. The math no longer worked. West Germany asked for gold. Spain asked for gold. Switzerland asked for gold. And in the summer of 1971, Britain asked for $3 billion worth of gold to be physically shipped out of Fort Knox. That request, more than any other, broke the system. On the weekend of August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon flew to Camp David with 15 of his top advisers: Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and a young undersecretary named Paul Volcker, who would later become Fed Chairman himself. They argued for 2 days. And then, on Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, Nixon went on national television and gave a 15-minute speech that closed the gold window. Forever. The dollar would no longer be exchangeable for gold. The promise made at Bretton Woods, the promise that had anchored the global financial system for 27 years, was simply revoked. Other governments could keep their dollars or trade them, but the gold was no longer on the table. It was, in the cold language of economics, a default, the largest sovereign default in human history. And no one could do anything about it. The world now faced a question that should have been impossible. Why hold a currency no longer backed by gold? Why hold dollars at all? The answer arrived 3 years later, in the form of a quiet diplomatic understanding between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. On June 8, 1974, Henry Kissinger and Crown Prince Fahd bin Abdulaziz signed a joint commission agreement in Washington. Treasury Secretary William Simon's deputy flew to Riyadh. The terms were never published in a single signed treaty, but the architecture was unmistakable. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in United States dollars. Saudi Arabia would recycle its surplus oil revenues into United States Treasury bonds and American weapons. In exchange, the United States would protect the Saudi regime and its oil fields with the full weight of its military. Within a year, every member of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries was pricing oil in dollars. Henry Kissinger called the new arrangement petrodollar recycling. Stop and consider what that meant. Every nation on Earth needed oil. Every nation, therefore, needed dollars to buy oil. The dollar had been quietly transformed, It was no longer backed by gold sitting in a vault in Kentucky. It was backed by something far more flexible. It was backed by oil. It was backed by the unspoken understanding that the United States Navy would keep the shipping lanes of the Persian Gulf open. It was backed by the fact that the global economy itself now depended on a steady supply of green American paper. This is the architecture you and I still live inside. As of last year, 58% of all foreign exchange reserves in the world are still held in United States dollars. The euro is at 20%. The Chinese renminbi is at 2%. The system, designed in a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944, defaulted on in a television speech in 1971, and quietly resurrected in a Saudi palace in 1974, that system is still the one running the planet you live in today. Look around you. The currencies you trade, the screens you watch, the fuel that moves your world. All of it is governed by an architecture designed nearly a century ago by a small group of men in shadowed rooms. The empire never went away. It only learned to wear better clothes. History does not teach us who was right and who was wrong. It teaches us that the greatest power on earth has always belonged to whoever wrote the rules, and that those rules, once written, can outlive every nation, every leader, every generation that ever swore to live by them. The dust of history has settled, but the vibe remains. Keep listening. Keep questioning. This is the Epic History Vibe, signing off.